Hi, Jeffrey.
Hello, Jackie. How are you?
I'm fine. Welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you very much. It feels strangely like my office.
Since this is your first time on Blogging Heads, why don't you introduce yourself?
Great. I'm Jeffrey Lewis. I'm the executive director of the project on managing the atom and publisher of the blog armscontrolwonk.com.
Your blog has kind of quickly become the kind of seminal place for people interested in arms control issues to go to kind of get information. Do you want to just say something about why you decided to start your blog?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, that really came out of the debate over Iraq, particularly in the aftermath when people in the Bush administration were saying things like, we were all wrong. And I recall kind of scratching my head and thinking, you know, I wasn't wrong, but I didn't write it down anywhere. I didn't publish any articles on the subject, and so I thought it would be good to create a daily record of just how right I am.
Well, that's always a good thing, to be right all the time. Well, today we're going to kind of do the North Korea, we're going to kind of do a wraparound of the whole North Korea issue, try to explain what exactly happened in the mountain, how we know what happened or what we don't know, talk about some of the ramifications, and maybe some of the big picture political issues, who's to blame, who's not to blame, and what we can do about it, where we go from here. So why don't we just start by talking about what exactly happened in that mountain in northern North Korea and how we know what happened there. So
well, there was an explosion about less than a kiloton. A kiloton's 1,000 tons of TNT. So it's a big boom, but probably not. I mean, a real nuclear weapon going off, or at least a successful one, is 20 times as big as that. And what we know is we have seismic data. There are rumblings in the earth from the explosion, and the rumblings were kind of small. And then now it looks like there's been a little bit of radioactivity leaking out. But that's more or less the data we have. Oh, and the North Koreans bragging about it.
Yeah, there's that. I mean, last week there was sort of, when anything like this happens, often the first information to kind of hit the wires is wrong, and you do have to kind of sit back and wait a little while. And one of the things you and I talked a lot about last week was the wide range in estimates of how large this blast was. There were some Russian seismic monitoring stations that were saying it was huge. And but very quickly that was kind of debunked. And even now, the range in size is from sort of 200 kilotons at the low end to maybe approaching a kiloton. And it's still clear that we really don't know exactly how big the boom was. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, these things are hard to estimate, particularly when it doesn't go off as planned, and we can talk about that. But my guess is the North Koreans probably don't know because they don't. Estimating these things is tough. The Russian case is kind of interesting because the Russian defense minister came out almost immediately after the test and was like, oh, it's 5 to 15 kilotons, so it's really big. But I actually have now dug up the Russian seismic data, and it's lower than ours. So I don't know where he got that. I mean, that was not something that they estimated based on the strength of the seismic signal. So I had the sneaking suspicion that, the North Koreans either told them before or after how big it was, and he just kind of rushed out and, declared it. There are a couple other explanations. It might be that they just figured, if North Korea did it, it would be this size. But that was, I think, pretty misleading information and actually really irresponsible.
Let's just talk for a second about could this all have been a hoax. I mean, I think it's been widely debunked now, but I think that there are some people, for whatever reason, are thinking maybe you might have just trucked several hundred tons of TNT into a mountain and detonated it. So let's kind of put this to rest once and for all.
Well, conspiracy theories are fun.
They are. Conspiracy.
Can we play with it a little
and with
before
North Korea especially, they're like completely prone to kind of hoaxing, and you can weave a lot of paranoid fantasies about.
Sure.
So okay, but why? Just sort of explain in simple terms why this was not a hoax.
Well, there are two reasons. I mean, one is technical, which is now we have radioactivity, right? And so it seems pretty clear that that's what this was. But the second, which I was sticking to at the beginning, which I think is really pretty compelling, is why stage a failure? Right? I mean, the whole point of this of the size of this explosion is that it's ambiguous. It's not clear that it was successful. And so if you were going to fake something, you wouldn't fake something that makes you look stupid.
Right. Now, speaking of failures, clearly this was a fizzle, a flub, whatever you want to call it. The bomb didn't go boom like it was supposed to.
Right.
There are lots of reasons for this. Could be impurities in their plutonium stockpile.
Right.
Could be a problem with their implosion device. Do you want to just say something about a couple of these theories and you know how, and maybe explain how hard it is to make an implosion device?
Right. Well, I mean,
work?
the first thing to say is it was supposed to be easy. I mean, we all used to think that the hard part was getting the plutonium, and once you had that, any idiot could build a bomb. So, I don't know, it reminds me of something somebody once said, which was, you know, if you make something idiot-proof, the world will build a better idiot, and they screwed it up, which I'm a little baffled by. There are three explanations that I've heard. One is that the plutonium had lots of non-fissile isotopes of plutonium, which is to just say it was dirty. But all of the IAEA sampling of their plutonium suggested it was pretty clean, that it was almost all, well, that there wasn't very much plutonium-240 contamination. So I kind of have dismissed that one. Then there are two other theories, one of which is there's this, if you want to really get a nice, good bang to make the explosion really efficient, you want to add something called a neutron initiator, which just, well, it's safe to say that there's some technical tricks. And that can be a little bit hard, and so I've been seeing people suggesting that maybe they bollocks that up. And then the third thing, which is what I kind of lean toward, is this idea that the North Koreans were trying to make a deliverable weapon for a missile, and that requires kind of more sophisticated techniques for, you know, you compress the sphere of plutonium with conventional explosives so that it goes critical and then explodes. And that if you want to make a smaller bomb, there are more sophisticated things you can do with the explosives. And I've been kind of leaning toward the idea that the North Koreans tried that, and that's what screwed them up.
I mean, I think it's probably important to note that, you know, we're just sort of assuming that this was a plutonium-based bomb, and we're assuming that because we know that they have a plutonium reprocessing facility, and we know that at various times they have unloaded the spent fuel rods from their reactor, and we're, you know, because they've said we've reprocessed the plutonium. But there's also a whole other, you know, way of making a nuclear bomb. That's via enriching uranium. We have very little information about North Korea's uranium program, and if you have a uranium-based weapon, conventional wisdom is that uranium-based weapons are a little easier to explode, and you know.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So we're just sort of assuming that they used their plutonium and that and that it didn't work, you know, as you've kind of outlined.
Well, I mean, I should add that we don't think that they ever got around to enriching uranium. I mean, they were importing components for a plant that would allow them to do that, but whether they've actually built that plant, at least I think that's unlikely. So that's why I'm assuming it's plutonium. And, I mean, we know they have plutonium. I mean, there is no doubt about that. That's, you know, that was under IAEA safeguards. So, I mean, it would be a little weird of them to, you know, not blow up the plutonium that they should obviously have.
Right. And they have, let's see, the ISIS, the group that I work for, issued a paper recently estimating that North Korea's plutonium stockpile was between 43 and 61 kilograms. And that is, I think, enough, ISIS concluded, for between 4 and 13 weapons. So they haven't made a huge dent in their stockpile with this test. Now, one interesting thing is that they haven't tested subsequently. When Pakistan tested, they kind of ran a bunch of them at once. What do you think? Do you think we can expect a little more seismic activity from North Korea?
You know, actually, right now I'm leaning toward not. I mean, we talk about this thing as though it's a test, but it was really a demonstration, right? I mean, this wasn't like a big science project. I mean, the North Koreans did this for political reasons. And the North Koreans, at least, are insisting the thing was totally successful. So... Well,
they've asked for our congratulations.
Right. So, I mean, running another test does sort of cast doubt, especially if you get... I mean, if they succeed and get the full yield, then we know that the first test was a failure, and as a consequence, they have sort of less certainty. So if I were them, I figure, you cut your losses, you call it a victory, you say it was successful, and, move on.
Right. Okay, one thing...
But, they're crazy. Who knows?
They're crazy. I'm like the first person to admit they're crazy, but I hate kind of saying that. I think it's lame. I mean, I think they're probably not really that crazy. I mean, I think that, yes, they're all members of a religious cult, and it's a very totalitarian, fascist style. I thought there was a great op-ed in the New York Times. I don't have the site handy, but it was by someone explaining that this is really not a Stalinist country. This is totalitarianism, and it's very fascism in its kind of purest form in some ways. Their whole ideology is replete with references to the purity of their race and all kinds of things. So, but all that aside, I hate falling in the trap of saying the North Koreans are just nuts.
Yeah, I was being.
No, I know you were, but I mean in general, people are. Anyway, well, here's the thing. Apropos of this, North Koreans are nuts. They'll do anything for money. I am amazed by the number of people on kind of all sides of the political spectrum who genuinely seem worried that North Korea is going to sell a weapon to either a country or some rogue actor, Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And the next thing we're going to hear is that it might be detonated inside an American city. And there's this genuine concern now that, they've joined the club and that they've never not sold any of their weapons programs, and they are hard up for cash, and they're about to be even harder up because that UN sanctions committee is about to turn the noose a little tighter.
Right.
So, let's talk about the terrorist threat from a North Korea origin weapon. Let's pretend the worst thing happens and
right.
There's an explosion in an American city of a bomb. How easy is it to trace it back to North Korea? And I guess my other point is, would we even wait to bother to be sure we traced it back, or would we just kind of assume Iran?
You're it.
Anyway, so let's just talk for a second about the risks. How hard it is to detonate a bomb. I think, and we should explain about things like permissive action links and sort of decoupled warheads from their the fissile
right.
material. Anyway, so go ahead, say whatever comes to mind.
Well, I mean, my first answer is kind of flip again, which is to say, if I'm a terrorist, I'm not going to pay too much for that North Korean bomb.
Right.
That's a flip answer. Even if you were to get a kiloton of yield, if you were a terrorist, that would be, remarkably successful. It would
be good
achieve the, goal of terrifying. Would we know if they got it from the North Koreans? Maybe. I mean, we have samples of some of their plutonium, and so we probably ought to be able to trace some of it back. But maybe not necessarily all. And that's actually a project we have here at the Project on Managing the Atom, is just trying to figure out how good our capacity is in that regard. I'm quite taken by your suggestion, which is it's unclear that, we'd wait for the eggheads to get back from the lab
right.
with samples. I mean,
wait, we don't have the analysis yet. We can't, yes,
yeah,
yes,
right.
yeah, no.
Yeah, that really sounds like this president, doesn't it?
No, not at all. So, there are other countries with nuclear weapons that are not members of the N.P.T. Should we be
Three,
worried?
Actually.
Yes. India, Pakistan, and Israel. And should we be worried about a Pakistani bomb going astray?
I mean, that freaks me out. I don't know about you, but right, like the fact that they have these tribal areas that are rife with Al-Qaeda guys running around,
right?
And that the intelligence services in Pakistan, supported the Taliban. I do wonder about civil military control there, or civil control of the weapons. Well, I mean, right? It's kind of a military government. It's a screwy situation, and I know, sometimes there's the methinks she does protest too much kind of thing, like in the new book by the president of Pakistan, which I've got actually.
Musharraf, yeah, right.
Not that I'm trying to sell it, but he goes on at length about how safe and secure Pakistan's weapons are. it's like, no, they're really secure. And so the more you read
does
it,
does he talk about how they keep their fissile material separate from the warhead?
Not really. I mean, he simply says that that they sort of have now settled on a chain of command, kind of implying that control was like not super certain before he got there.
Well, my understanding is that Pakistan does keep its the actual weapon housing separate from the nuclear material. And
so like the pit is
in a different
someplace
place.
else.
So yeah, and then I also understand, I could be totally wrong about this, but I thought that the U.S. at least offered to sell or give Pakistan the technology to create the same type of so-called permissive action links
Right.
that we use to keep our weapons safe, in safe mode. And I don't know whether they took us up on that or have their own, but
Yeah, it's not clear to me that we actually did that. I mean, I know that there are guys in the administration who supported that kind of idea, and I know that there was at least some kind of informal investigation into it. And it's not actually, I think, a terrible idea. I mean, it maybe violates the N.P.T, the sort of treaty against spreading
Right.
nuclear weapons technology,
Right.
and maybe creates a little bit of moral hazard, like, don't do this, but if you do, we'll help you. But, on the other hand, like, I really like Pakistan to have coded locks on their nuclear bombs.
Right. But listen,
which
like,
is essentially what a permissive action
you're
link
like,
is.
I thought we were going to be helping people to sleep better at night, and I guess we're not. So this is not where I thought this conversation was going. So you are. I mean, I guess I'm not worried. Look. I really don't. I don't believe that North Korea is going to sell a completed weapon to
That's
Al-Qaeda.
because you live in Princeton.
And that Al-Qaeda is going to successfully bring it into the United States and detonate it. I just don't think that chain of events is likely to happen. I mean,
That's because nobody would bother with Princeton.
no, but seriously, look, if I were
Yeah, you're
Iran, for
probably
example, as you kind of alluded to, I think I'd turn to North Korea and say, keep it. For half the price, we can make our own, and it'll be better.
Right. I mean, I think you have a point there. I mean, for me, this is a difficult subject because I think it's a low-risk, high-impact event. Like, I don't think North Korea would sell a nuclear weapon, and I don't think that a terrorist group is likely to have the kind of sophistication to do this. But I don't think it's totally impossible, and so it's kind of an interesting balance. So I wrote an article about this with a colleague, and we run into this problem, which is to say that on the one hand, you want to say that you think this is a possibility, but on the other hand, it's not a reason to like gut the Fourth Amendment, right? And so it's really hard to figure out how much to worry. And so I think that it might be that we don't necessarily have different assessments of the risk. It's just that we are maybe taking a slightly different tone about how you respond to these kind of low-risk, high-impact events.
Right. Well, there's no question it's a high-impact event, even if the bomb didn't really work. I mean, shudder to think about that. And I mean, I remember, you probably remember too, the mid-'80s, the whole freeze movement, Helen Caldicott's book, Concentric Circles, Circular Error Probable, and the real kind of terror and fear that people in their church groups felt about the possibility of a nuclear bomb going off anywhere near them. And look, so I'm not trying to minimize this by any means. I just don't see as likely. Look, if North Korea put a weapon on a ship and tried to send it somewhere and got caught, it would be the end of the regime. That's it. It would be over for them.
Yeah, again, let me say, I think these are all absolutely right. I mean, if I gave you the impression that I think North Korea is likely to sell a nuclear weapon or is likely to try to use its nuclear weapons as anything other than, a deterrent that sits in a shed, then I was wrong. I mean, I do think that there is an enormous amount of deterrence and constraint at work on the North Koreans.
Right. Okay, so setting aside North Korea,
I've learned never to disagree with you.
I guess we've agreed that it's a scary possibility, but not one that we believe is likely, and also not likely that a Pakistani bomb is going to find its way out of Pakistan. We hope.
Yeah, no,
anyway.
not likely.
Not likely. Less than.
I'd still rather the Pakistanis not have bombs.
Yes,
though.
obviously. Right. And sort of Israel, we really don't need to be worried about, because if anyone is reportedly going to be able to keep their nuclear weapons safe,
I think, we don't know a lot about Israeli security procedures, but in a way that's comforting, right? Because it means they're reasonably good about keeping that kind of stuff under control.
Right. Okay. The other issue that this discussion has raised is the nuclear domino problem.
Right.
And this, to me, is a real hand-wringing issue. I mean, this is another thing that I feel is like completely overblown in some of the mainstream media, and I feel like I'm constantly trying to veer away from the notion, for example, that Saudi Arabia, because it's a Sunni country, is going to go nuclear because their Persian Shiite neighbors in Iran have the bomb. But let's just talk for a second about but on the other hand, there is some news that we ought to be aware of. Brazil is, and Egypt both are, well, Egypt is a little further behind, but they have, nuclear power programs, and they may or may not involve, in Brazil's case, it will involve, in Egypt, we don't know, enrichment technology. So let's just talk for a second about nuclear dominoes and whether this is a likely scenario or whether this is more...
Yeah, I think it's pretty unlikely. The way that I've always thought about this is it's wrong to talk about governments like they're people, right? It's not like, when you're, like out at a bar with your friends and someone calls you a jerk, and so you, like call them a jerk back and, you retaliate. Governments make decisions by consensus, and there are bureaucracies and there are people with interests. And so, my guess is that the people in Egypt who want a nuclear weapon, are just going to want one no matter what happens. And the people who don't want Egypt to have a nuclear weapon are not going, they're not going to change their mind. And so I think that a lot of this kind of domino effect stuff exists completely in ignorance of how governments actually make decisions. Now, that's not to say that changes in the world don't subtly alter these kinds of perspectives, particularly over time. When people who are opposed to a bomb program retire and they're replaced by younger people, those people's ideas may have been shaped by the amount of proliferation occurring, or how Iran succeeds or fails in its efforts. But like the idea that the Iranians are going to go and everybody is going to wake up and be like, what was I thinking? Let's go get one, is, I think, kind of silly.
It is silly. And I think the other point that has to be made is, if, let's say, Egypt decide, there may very well be factions in Egypt that think a bomb would be cool to have, but let's be real. Egypt receives a huge amount of foreign assistance from the United States and from other countries. First thing to be sacrificed if there was ever a whiff of a serious bomb program in Egypt. And I think that levers like that are important, not to mention that Iran has paid a very high price for its nuclear and for other choices it's made. And North Korea is possibly paying the ultimate price now for its choices. There's just no sense that I have that countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are prepared to join Iran in that level of international isolation. And I think that's the most compelling reason that we should not sit in fear of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
I think you're totally right about that. That nobody looks at North Korea and says, "Wow, I want to sign up for that plan. How do we get there?" And so the Bush administration in particular has been pounding this idea over and over and over again that we can't let the Iranians and North Koreans get away with it. We're letting them cheat, and there's no punishment. But it sort of ignores the degree to which these states are, in fact, fundamentally isolated. North Korea, obviously, much more than Iran, and the sense that doesn't, that it's not that, they're building the bomb in part because they're isolated, right? And there's almost no state in the world, I think, that is eager to replicate that model.
Right. And look, there is definitely on kind of a parallel track with, all of the worries that we have about nuclear proliferation and Iran and North Korea. On a parallel track, the world is coming to terms with the fact that, energy, there's major issues about access to energy. So it is understandable under such circumstances that countries like Brazil might say, look, nuclear power, it's in our future, and here's the deal. I don't understand why Brazil has decided it needs to enrich its own uranium. I don't understand what the economy of scale is for Brazil. I'm assuming that it's because they're going to have many more nuclear reactors than Iran, for example.
Actually, this is something we've been talking a lot about here. I think that's a debate that we're having, where there are a lot of folks who are asking the question of whether or not it makes economic sense for a country like Brazil or Iran to enrich their own fuel. And one thing that I would add is that, it is so expensive to build nuclear power plants that the additional cost of making the fuel yourself as opposed to buying it is like a decimal point, right? So if you sit down in a meeting and you decide to spend $7.2 billion on a nuclear energy program over the next decade, the fact that it becomes, 7.6 if you're going to make your own nuclear fuel.
Is that really all it is? It's just...
Yeah, that the Brazilian plant cost $200 million. Less than $200 million, actually, and so did the Iranian plant. So it doesn't make sense economically. It's still much cheaper to buy the fuel. But I suspect that in the decision room, it's, a couple of decimal points. Boy, we're really disagreeing a lot today, Jackie. Are you still going to be my
but I
friend?
mean, I'm just still, look, Brazil's in the club. Not in the nuclear club, but Brazil's I should say, under the tent of the Nonproliferation Treaty. It's a good actor in the region. It sort of makes responsible decisions.
Oh,
and
I'm
it's sort
really
of setting
not
a bad
freaked out about
example by saying we're going to enrich our own uranium, and it's certainly making it harder for us to say to Iran, you can't enrich your own uranium. Brazil's different. And so I wonder about that, and I also I wonder about the economics of it. I take your point about it only being a small margin onto the bottom line cost, but the optics of enriching your own uranium are problematic, and Brazil does have a nuclear history.
Right. I mean, well, with the Brazilians, all these stories are inherently complicated, and as I understand it, part of the issue with Brazil is that the scientists were pretty influential in discouraging Brazil from building nuclear weapons. And so it's not inconceivable to me that one of the payoffs, right, that a scientific community gets for not building nuclear weapons is this kind of robust nuclear industry for civilian purposes. And this is kind of the same challenge you face in Iran, where, to take the opposite case, India, it's totally the opposite, right, where the scientists are huge advocates of building nuclear weapons. And so, the challenge in Iran is how do you create a bureaucratic consensus within the country for restraint, for obeying their international obligations. And part of that is, the threat of force, but that's, only a small part. I mean, if the Iranians are determined to cheat, we're going to have real problems. And so you've got to find a way to convince, some critical mass of decision makers that there are things that Iranian scientists can be doing that contribute to the good. So one thing we've been thinking about are, various multinational arrangements so that, you keep scientists employed, but you can also keep an eye on the scientists who are employed.
Right. Well, this brings us to the next topic that.
Well, that was a smooth segue.
That was very smooth, very smooth. Being the N.P.T, how broken is it, and can it be fixed? And, where I come down on the N.P.T being broken is, I don't think it's as broken as many people allege, and I think that there are fixes that are viable. And anyway, well, let's just talk about, is the N.P.T broken, and, share some of your thoughts about that. And we should talk about the whole assured fuel supply.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think the N.P.T is broken. I think that the N.P.T faces challenges, as it has every year since the treaty was signed. Well, the regime as a whole, really. I mean, it's not just the treaty, right? I mean, it's this entire network of the bargain that nuclear states would give up their nuclear weapons at some point in the future in exchange for restraint now on the part of non-nuclear states, all the kinds of technical cooperation that exists, all of the norms against spreading dangerous technologies, all that kind of stuff. That will always face challenges, and some of those challenges, I think, are principally technical, right? As technologies change, the balance between safeguards and proliferation change, so it becomes, harder or easier. There are always going to be some states that want to cheat. There'll always be, well, we hope not always, but at least there have always been states that are outside the regime. And so, part of the normal daily routine of diplomacy to stop the spread of nuclear weapons is confronting these kinds of challenges. And I think a lot of people who, talk about how the regime is dead are people who didn't like the regime to begin with, right? They're the sort of people who want selective proliferation. Our friends can have it and our enemies can't. It's not about rules and it's not about treaties, it's about power. And, those people I think are always going to seize on any challenge, no matter how big or small, to paint this incredibly bleak and pessimistic picture.
Right. Well, one of the biggest reasons that the NPT is criticized, especially by countries in the non-aligned movement, is that the nuclear powers haven't made good on their commitment to undertake serious, substantive steps toward nuclear disarmament. That's been a talking point at every NPT review conference since probably the first one in 1972. Was that the first one? Around there? Something like that? They're held every, 5 years? They're every 5 years. Yeah. Okay, so 1973. Anyway, whatever. I guess we ought to know, Jeffrey, we ought to know the dates of all of the NPT review conferences.
Well, I mean, they're every 5 years. They're, 2000,
right,
2005, 95.
95,
90.
Right. So that's always been a complaint. But now we have sort of this added problem of feeling like the NPT isn't doing its job to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy on the one hand and curb and deter and detect cheating on the other. And I feel like there haven't been, in that famous speech that President Kennedy gave, talking about, by 1975, whatever, we might have, some order of magnitude more. And we don't.
It was in the 20s.
It was in the 20s. Okay, we have 9 now, if you include North Korea. That's not a good number, but it's not the worst-case scenario that lots of people fear.
Well, and it's worth noting that, of that 9, 7 of them were nuclear when the NPT was signed, essentially. The Indians didn't test for a few more years, but they were, that horse was out of the barn. And so only Pakistan and North Korea came after. And then, obviously maybe Iran.
So is the regime such a big failure? I mean, that's I think the question. Okay, the 5 nuclear powers have not achieved total disarmament. I don't know to what extent that's a realistic objective anyway. But certainly, let's say they could have taken greater steps than they've made already. Beyond that, and that's a big thing, I'll concede. It's not so clear to me that even the cheating that the IAEA safeguards inspectors didn't detect was really of an order that sort of deserves scrapping of the entire regime and starting over again.
I totally agree with you. I mean, the first thing I would say is we forget that compliance is the norm, right? There are more than 100 countries who have signed the treaty. There are really only, as we've discussed, 3 countries that are outside of it, and then the Israel, India, and Pakistan, and then you've got the North Korea and Iran issues kind of bubbling around. But everyone else adheres to the treaty and adheres to it essentially faithfully.
Exactly.
And in cases where we do find violations, I mean, in a way, it's good news because we tend to find violations, right? Like, I'm often amazed at the Iranian situation where people talk about how this was a tremendous failing of the regime. But the fact is that Iran has done some suspicious stuff, and we wouldn't know about it without the regime. And the fact that the regime brought this information to light, about a decade before we think Iran can actually successfully build a bomb, I think is a huge success. And if we, choose to squander that 10 years and do nothing, right, and don't seriously engage the Iranians and don't find a way to meet their legitimate needs while, not letting them have a bomb, I don't think you pin that on the NPT, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
Ultimately, a treaty is just a collection of signatories, and if we don't have the collective will to do something about it, that's a choice we make. And in particular, it's a choice the United States makes.
So the one big fix, though, that it seems like lots of people can agree is maybe something that the NPT should undertake, is this idea of a fuel bank, an assured fuel supply. And I always love it when, like, a big American philanthropist decides this is a good idea and to put money behind it, because Warren Buffett apparently has given $50 million to the IAEA. I think things like that are great. I mean, but you have
Well, it'll be interesting to see if the IAEA actually ever spends that money, but
yeah.
It's a wonderful gesture, and it's a gesture in the direction of the policy that we certainly need.
Right, right. So the IEA has its initiative for a fuel bank, and then there's also one that Russia has. So there are a few of these initiatives bubbling around. You know, I guess it's our hope that, you know, one of them kind of takes root. But
Is that your cell phone?
that's my cell phone, but I hope I've turned it off now.
You're supposed to turn those things off in meetings.
So
I had one. I was at a wedding over the weekend, and somebody's cell phone went off during the service.
that's the most embarrassing thing.
Yeah.
And yeah. All right. So, is there anything else we need to say about assured fuel supplies, other than how do we persuade countries like Iran that they should buy their fuel at the bank or take it out of the bank instead of making it on their own? I mean, that's the trick.
Yeah. I mean, in a case like Iran, you can't separate, I think, the fuel cycle issue, the desire that the Iranians have to be totally independent, from the degree to which they are fundamentally distrustful of the United States and Europe, right? I mean, until that relationship is, I don't want to say fixed, but until there is some progress on that relationship, until Iranian policymakers have confidence that, you know, the United States and Europe are, and really the United States, are serious about reaching some kind of arrangement by which, you know, we can all live together, I think that, you know, the promise from the IAEA that they're going to deliver fuel is probably not going to be worth very much. I mean,
Right.
ultimately, right, I mean, there is no country called the IAEA. That fuel will be in countries. And I can just, you know, if the United States decides to, if the United States, for example, prevails upon Russia or France or someone to cut off fuel supplies, right, to a future Iranian nuclear program, it's hard to imagine the country who's going to be sitting on that fuel, right, who isn't going to be subject to U.S. pressure. So I think the fuel bank is a wonderful idea, but it still exists in a political context where the United States exerts a tremendous amount of authority and influence, which, by the way, is, I'm happy that we have, but that authority gives us also a certain responsibility. And in this case, I think, you know, we have to make some progress on the relationship with Iran.
Yeah. Well, maybe by talking to them.
And, you know, I mean, the Iranians, I don't want to, you know, it's not like they're blameless in all this. I mean, they did cheat on their agreement.
They did
and,
cheat.
Like, that's reason to be really skeptical.
Substantially, actually.
What?
Iran cheated substantially. Iran's cheating wasn't passive. I mean, it was with malice and forethought.
Yeah, I mean, they're cheaters.
Yeah, they're cheaters. Okay.
But, you know, as Bob Gallucci once said, you know that there are people in the world who cheat, right? The question is, are you willing to say, under no circumstances will we ever negotiate with a cheater? And, you know, because if that's true, be hanging out by ourselves.
That actually, in a kind of a nutshell, it captures the difference between the Bush administration and the Clinton administration's approach toward these issues.
Right.
Can you sit down and talk to a cheater? And that brings us to our final topic, which is who's to blame.
For North Korea or Iran?
Well, let's just talk about North Korea, and then we can talk about who's to blame for Iran. But in North Korea, you know, who's to blame? You and I probably aren't going to disagree wildly on this, but let's just be fair to our friends in the Bush administration. Do we have any friends in the Bush administration? Yes, we do.
Well, I used to have friends in the Bush administration.
Yes, we do. Are they scheduled?
Actually, yes, we still do.
We do. Okay.
I actually just got a picture of myself talking to one of said friends at a conference. And I'm going to frame it and put it on my wall.
Good.
So
do that.
You know.
Do that. It's important to be nonpartisan. Look, no one held a gun to North Korea's head.
I'm totally nonpartisan. If, you know, the Bush administration wants to adopt sensible policies, I'm happy.
Yes. But look, I mean, just to be fair to the Bush administration, no one forced North Korea to stick a pile of fissile material in a mountain and try to detonate it. And certainly the Bush administration didn't secretly collude with them to do this in some effort to shore up its lagging support in advance of the November elections. I mean, that's like, you know, look, this wasn't all cooked up by someone. North Korea did this on its own, and I think, I think that the Security Council response that very strong resolution, I think, is an honest effort by 15 countries to kind of come together and cobble together some kind of sensible punitive measure for taking that step. And I think it's actually of all the things the Bush administration has achieved in the Security Council, arguably this resolution is probably one of its best achievements.
I think that that's true. I mean, for the initial response to the nuclear test, things have been competent. I mean, we've got, I think one had to get a resolution. They went out, they got the resolution. They've got the Chinese and the Russians saying more or less the right things. So, I have no complaints about their post-Korean test diplomacy. Now, the question is, with the tremendous advantage that provides, what are we going to do with it? And I think that's going to get us back to our who's to blame question. I mean, the fundamental question is, does the strategy that the Bush administration began pursuing in 2000, in 2001 when they took office, does that strategy represent a, feasible method to achieve our interests on the Korean Peninsula? And if the answer to that is no, then they have to change or they're going to squander this opportunity. It's not clear to me that they think the answer to that is no.
Well, let's just talk about what their strategy was, because I think when you go back, when you rewind the tape of U.S.-North Korea relations beginning with Bush taking office, what you see actually is a pretty remarkable change in tone and in rhetoric and in actions from the 2001 and throughout 2002. And we should note for people that the kind of triggering event when the U.S.-North Korea relationship really started to go south and the agreed framework fell apart in a big way was when Jim Kelly was the assistant secretary at the time, went to North Korea, had a meeting with them. It was October of 2002.
Right.
And the North Koreans said in the meeting, by the way, we have a secret uranium enrichment program, something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, although they had data, right, and they confronted the North Koreans about it. But what I find interesting about this is it's not clear to me. I mean, I think what happened is I think we knew the North Koreans had a uranium enrichment program, right? But the ways in which we knew were probably not the kinds of things that you want to go revealing to people, right? And in particular, I'm thinking this case of the Swiss engineer in the con network that we flipped.
Right.
And so I think it was only when, and this is speculation, so I have to be a little bit careful, but I think it's only when we have an intercepted shipment of, I think there were miraging steel tubes, or maybe just miraging steel, that we have something we can confront the North Koreans about. And then, so Kelly says, hey, you're doing X, right? And the North Koreans say something ambiguous, which amounts to, yeah, what of it? And then the thing falls apart. But it's not.
But in the run-up to that, I think in the run-up to that October, that sort of watershed meeting, in the run-up to that, for a whole year prior to that, there had been all kinds of statements about North Korea not living up to it. And let's just also be clear, the Bush administration came to office hating this deal, hating the agreed framework. Senator McCain hated
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
No one liked it.
So that's why I picked 2001. I mean, I figured they were going to...
You had Axis of Evil in the January 2002 State of the Union.
And don't forget that the reason I initially said 2000 is I was thinking of the case where Clinton, right, was talking about going to Pyongyang to finalize a deal on the missile program, right? And they talked to the people, talked to the Bush administration, the incoming Bush administration, to see how they would feel about that. And the incoming Bush administration said, don't do it.
Right.
So, they don't get into office by January 2001, but they're already in late 2000, after the election, scuppering the Clinton administration's, I think, reasonably successful, all things considered, diplomacy on the North Korean issue.
Right. That's right. Okay, so we're in agreement that the Bush administration came to office with sort of a bad attitude toward the agreed framework. Things worsened in the early part of the administration. Sanctions were imposed in August of 2002. So by October, when Kelly made that trip to Pyongyang and things fell apart, things were already bad.
Yeah, I think so. And let me say, I mean, we keep saying the Bush administration, but I think the real fundamental problem here is that there is a lack of coordination or a lack of agreement, right? There are some people in the Bush administration, and I would suggest it's probably even a majority, who are, I think, willing to be quite reasonable and interested in averting a war and interested in getting a denuclearization of the peninsula. But there are a few people, some of whom may sit in the vice president's office, who seem to have no interest whatsoever in that.
Certainly, I think it's true that the people who have been in charge of the North Korea issue throughout the Bush administration have been among the less ideological, more
absolutely.
sane.
Yeah.
Whoever,
So I don't want to pin
Hill,
this on
right,
them.
Right, right.
I mean, when you've got no strategy, right, or at least you have a strategy that is negative by default, it doesn't matter how competent are the people who you ask to execute it.
Right, right. So
But
okay,
this is not on Krista.
So we've agreed it's not the fault of the North Korean negotiators.
No.
Not their fault. It's a problem of sort of, back in the NSC and in the vice president's office and in other places where the attitude is we just simply refuse to talk to people who.
Well, right. I mean, those negotiators have to negotiate every agreement twice, right? They have to negotiate it in Pyongyang and then in Washington.
Right.
Right. And if there are people in Washington who, simply want no agreement, right? They're not interested in good faith negotiations on getting something, that secures the U.S. interest. They view the U.S. interest as having no agreement whatsoever. It's almost, impossible to overcome that kind of roadblock.
Right. So, what are you going to be blogging about with respect to North Korea?
Oh, radionuclides. It looks like we have a little radioactivity vented from the test, so we should be able to make some judgments about the bomb. Maybe in another day or so, we'll get some noble gases. It's exciting.
Can you talk about what specific elements were detected?
I can't because I don't see the data. I mean, I haven't seen the data.
Right.
There hasn't been an announcement, and nobody I know is talking. Somebody in the intelligence community is talking. Maybe someone's talking to you.
No, well, I haven't seen anything today. Nothing's come up today. I thought there was going to be an announcement by Negroponte's office sometime this morning.
Right.
But
I mean, I would, you just occasionally get these stories, and the stories are super vague, right? It's like, we've detected radioactivity.
Right. Right.
And it's like, well, okay, I mean, that's helpful, but I'd kind of like to know, how much Pu-240 is there, and particularly since, you're not going to get the full data, and the radiochemistry stuff would be way too tough for me to do. But, you can make really technically informed judgments if you get enough debris.
Right.
That's
Okay,
what I'd love to see.
let's hope for some debris.
Well, I mean, if you live in the area, right, debris, not good.
Right.
But if you're hanging out over here and you want to know about their bomb,
we're talking trace quantities of debris. We're not. No one's getting sick in the fallout.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty small amounts, but
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, this was good. Is there anything else we need to talk about? I think we've covered North Korea really well, and I think that that was our mission for today. So.
Yeah, but let's, and some other day we'll talk about Iran, but let's wait for it to really blow up,
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, thanks, Jeffrey.
Okay.